Here we go again. Another patch hit Overwatch 2 yesterday, and as usual, the patch has a lot of baggage with it. Some good, some bad, and some just downright confusing. It really makes me question. I want to take, before we take the time to take a look at the patch notes, can I just say one thing, just one really important thing? I wish we had a better insight as to what the vision, what the processes, what the goals were with balancing in Overwatch 2. I think we've talked a lot about how bringing my own biases when it comes to what I would love to see in terms of hero design and hero balance with Overwatch 2, what I think needs to be nerfed, what I think needs to be reworked, buffed, and all that kind of stuff. But I think more than anything else, so many of these changes are just changes that it makes me wonder what are the conversations that are having behind closed doors. What is the vision of the Overwatch 2 balancing? What do they want to produce in this game? Do we even know? Is there even a vision anymore? Because there is no evident rhyme or reason or consistent logic with many of these changes. And sometimes that can be a blessing because it's not all bad. The vision isn't bad or stupid. There just doesn't seem to be much of one at all. But that's partly what makes it so frustrating is so many times that there'll be changes that are like, oh, that's good, that's nice. And then why? Why are you doing that? Did you not think that one through? Do you not understand what that's going to do? Are you sure that's the direction that you want to go? And we'll elaborate more on today's specific patch notes. But if I had a dime for every single time that I've said that with patch notes, I would have many, 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 many dimes. Maybe I wouldn't be doing this for a living anymore. But anyway, let's take a look, starting off with the Mauga changes. The obvious thing is that these are Mauga Nerfs. The question is, were they the right nerfs? And the question is did they actually address many of the issues with his kit? And I think the answer to both of those questions is sadly no. Obviously, everyone is so sick and tired of Mauga in their ranked games. I think probably the worst that ranked has been since Overwatch 2 has released. Maybe the Roadhog only meta was a little bit worse at times, but honestly, not even then, I think Mauga has really single-handedly dominated the meta, and not in a good way, more so than maybe any hero in Overwatch 2 release. There have been other heroes that have been about almost as strong as he was on release, but they have not been as unfun to play versus even release Kiriko, release Sojourn, were more fun to play. So moving into Mauga, this is actually, hot take, not a good change. One of the big complaints of Mauga is that so much of his survivability is one-dimensional. It comes from his self-sustain. His health pool is pretty large, but he is also himself pretty large. And the severe lack of armor initially was part of the thing that made him extremely vulnerable to poke damage. And when he got naded or he wasn't healing, he just died instantly. And this is not the change that you want to see when it comes to addressing that problem. You see, the armor was the survivability that allowed you to go occasionally for plays besides shooting tank, because you had a little bit of extra armor to sustain you when you weren't healing yourself. And I think this is an absolutely unquestionably negative change. He needs armor. He just needs less sustain. And while they did address the sustain, they should have nerfed the sustain further and let him have the armor that he has. This is not the change. This you do not understand what's wrong with the character. And I think we're going to see a theme of that throughout the rest of the changes. And I want to be very clear here. The reason why this is such a big issue is because this is a really, really concerning red flag for the way the development team with Overwatch 2 works. I don't know if these changes were rushed over the holiday break, so maybe they didn't get the time to think them through or test them out, or really to have any good conversation about it. But this it's not even like one of these things where it's like it's up to interpretation about what are the issues with Mauga. It's not up for interpretation. You don't get to choose what is wrong with Mauga and what's not. It is objectively anybody, everywhere, Reddit, Twitter, anybody that spent any time in game knows that the issue is that you can only shoot the enemy tank, and you're unkillable when you shoot the enemy tank, and you murder the enemy tank. And really, only a couple of these changes actually address that issue, and many of those changes did not. And this change does not. This change is not the issue. This change does not help the issue at all. So very confusing and very frustrating change. That was very obviously an issue with the character design. This change is good. This means a lot, just AFK spamming both guns is bad. That is a good change. That is the change. That is a good nerf, not just a nerf, but a good nerf. This one is also pretty good as well. I don't love the cooldown increase. Going to sound a little bit like Sumito, but I would prefer if they'd left the cooldown as is and nerfed this further. There's no reason for a 60% lifesteal. That's more than enough. Over health plus whatever. We could nerf this to 50 or even 40% if you'd like to. and then left the cooldown as is. So he's not quite doesn't have these quite egregious vulnerability windows, but it's not also unbelievably unkillable while he has it active. I think those extremes are a little bit unfun. Cage Fight no longer grants infinite ammo. Still reloads Mauga's chain guns at the start of the ultimate. Sure, not really that big of a deal. But yes, the ultimate was too strong. This probably addresses that slightly. Not a big issue. Overhealth conversion rate decreased from 60 to 50%. So this is, I believe, a revert when they actually increase the overhealth conversion rate. I'm a little bit torn on this one because the overhealth conversion rate being lower in many ways wants to encourage you to keep that overhealth conversion rate at a higher rate. Like you need to keep it going because it is a lower percentage. So this doesn't really address the tank shooting thing either. It's just a net nerf. So what we have here is we have a net nerf, a net nerf, a net nerf, right? Overall, for sure. But really only one of these changes actually addresses the playstyle. You see, Mauga is worse. Is Mauga not going to be meta? I'm actually not too sure. I think he'd still be playable in a lot of circumstances. I think people are looking for any excuse not to play Mauga. So I do think that a lot of people are going to try to not play Mauga more than before. But is Mauga worse? Yes, objectively worse. Is he unplayable? Probably not. But the problem is that many of these changes don't really address the core issue with Mauga, which is the tank farming simulator. No tank should be a tank buster and only a tank buster. The most fun aspects of Mauga are interchangeably using your weapons, utilizing that poke weapon that really not even Sigma has the level of range and poke that Mauga has if he was allowed to use it. But he can't use it because he's too fat, he's too squishy, and he dies instantly. In fact, what we've done is we've actually had a net neutral change when it comes to Mauga, I think. I think that this is a positive change. This is a negative change for playstyle. And so what you have is you have a net nerf to Mauga, but you don't really you have really made zero progress in actually changing the gameplay loop that is fundamentally flawed with this character. And it is unbelievable to me that after all of these changes, that the gameplay loop is at best unchanged. And I think that's extremely disappointing to see. You don't just want balance patches to push characters in and out of the meta, like pulling so many levers. We could do that by tuning numbers till the cows come home, but that doesn't make the game fun to play. You need the characters that, even if they're not very strong, have fun playstyle mechanics. And Mauga is lacking that. And so again, we don't need better balancing from Mauga so much as we need some fundamental tweaks with how the abilities work. And they failed to do that. Orisa, remove the fall off damage penalty. A crazy buff. Not a crazy buff in terms of the power is going to be unbelievable. I think it will be. It will be a buff you will feel. I played a few games on Orisa yesterday. Definitely felt it. It's not like it's going to push her into an you must pick. It might not. This is obviously the huge one. Now immune to taking forced critical damage. Fortify already prevents direct critical damage from headshots, so it's a strict buff versus Mauga. I tested this yesterday. In a 1v1, Orisa with Fortify demolishes Mauga right now, even with Cardiac Overdrive. I don't think that's necessarily an issue because Fortify, you can play around it as Mauga because Mauga can basically just, as long as Mauga is able to run away, overrun, survive the Fortify, then he can still punish Orisa pretty hard. But this is a pretty significant buff. And the reason why this buff really irritated me is actually, of all the things to buff with Orisa, this is probably the most reasonable. It's the most fun, interesting aspect of the character. The problem is it fails to account for the fact that Orisa is another tank that people really hate playing versus. And so while this makes total sense, why? Why are we going to buff a character that is already extremely unfun to play versus as really almost any other tank in the game? Is that the direction that we want to go? Are we going to be cutting off our nose to spider face? Like, buff Orisa, so screw Mauga. Oh no, we have Orisa meta. And I'm scared that that's gonna be the case. Now, Orisa has a lot of very obvious limitations, but many of those limitations are not exploitable unless you're quite good at dive tanks or the map provides a lot of verticality. And not every map has that potential. So what I would have liked to have seen is if this is going to be put into play for consistency with projectiles, whatever that means, I'll go on that rant in a second, then I would have really liked a further nerf to Fortify, reducing the amount of damage reduction, something along those lines slightly, to compensate for the fact that she's going to be doing more damage. You cannot just do balance in a vacuum where, oh, this is good. Orisa's got a low win rate, or we want to make sure that Orisa counters Mauga because Orisa doesn't just play versus Mauga. Orisa plays versus Reinhardts and Divas and Winstons and Wrecking Balls and Doomfists? Do we really want to make her stronger unequivocally across the board? And I don't think the answer to that is yes. I don't think so. Not in her current state. We've obviously had a lot of ideas about to make Orisa more fun and more challenging. Tank rework video, check it out. Posted it about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. But this is not the kind of broad across the board buffs that we want. And even if it is to make projectiles consistent, consistency is not good game design necessarily. Roadhog, take a breather. Total amount healing reduced from 500 to 450. Cooldown between usage increased from 1.5 seconds. So there's a little bit more counterplay in terms of interrupting or playing around his breather. Fine. Pretty inoffensive change. It's a good change, I think. I think Roadhog is still not a very popular character for obvious reasons. And I think these are the type of changes that make a little bit more sense for opening up counterplay. Sojourn, gradual energy, no longer decays below 25%. So you know how you lose rail charge from 100 all the way to 0 when you build rail and you don't shoot anybody for a period of time. Now that's going to stop at 25 and never go below 25 unless you use the rail. But this is a pretty significant buff. You're going to be entering fights most of the time at a slightly higher rail charge. There's going to be less urgency about keeping damage up so that you don't totally lose your rail. It's going to be easier to maintain rail. It's going to be easier to 1v1. This is basically to call this a quality of life change, I don't think is really a good description. It is a pretty significant buff. It's not going to be, all of a sudden Sojourn has a 99% win rate, but it is a significant buff. And again, this is one of those changes like the Orisa change where it's just, why? This character was already relatively strong at many ranks. She's very flexible. She does have mechanical demands, but she's extremely powerful. Even for a high skill character, there's a huge amount of value to be gained from this character. I just don't understand. And if for whatever reason, I know we've had our issues with Blizzard balancing around win rates. If Sojourn's under the hood of the car, the win rates weren't there. I don't believe that at all. But let's say that is the case. This is not the change that you'd want. This makes the character significantly easier in terms of maintaining rail. And really, rail is in many aspects, the most frustrating aspect of the character with the least amount of counterplay. We've talked many times about how my problems with Sojourn are how weak her mouse 1 is, her primary fire, how overwhelmingly reliant on her rail she is. Many times we've talked about how they should have her spread tightened. They should reduce rail damage to it's 120. They should reduce the delay between railing and then shooting again so that you're able to weave your rails in burst damage comfortably. But there's so many things that they could do with rail. There's so many things they could have done with mouse 1 to buff her in a way that provides counterplay, provides dynamics, and doesn't just make her farm rail shoot. And yet here we are, and it's extremely disappointing. It's just extremely disappointing. Sombra, quality of life changes around stealth is the TLDR. I won't go into the details of what all of these are. Basically, it just makes it that stealth operates more consistently. It's fine. If I had to be negative about these, I would say that if you were to ask any Sombra main what they'd want in terms of quality of life, it's going to be Translocator. The ability is too slow. It's very buggy, the hitbox. I would say, I was talking with Twitch chat yesterday, and I would say anytime I play Sombra, I would say an average of once or twice, sometimes even 3 times per map, per game, I die or almost die because Translocator bugs out. We'll go back to the replay viewer, we'll see the arc of the Translocator, and it collides with an object that is 2 meters over to the side. Consistently happens to every single Sombra player, every single game. It's an issue with the coding of the size of the locator and when it's actually detonated. It goes earlier than it actually says it does. Very, very confusing. So while I appreciate these changes, I do think that the Translocator, if you're going to do anything quality of life with Sombra, the Translocator is a big priority. So a little bit disappointing, but hey, we'll take what we can get here. Effect duration reduced from 3.5 to 3 seconds. Sure. I would like to have seen this reduced for tanks specifically to 2 seconds. Or even 2.5 further, just so that I know that, we talk about consistency of the abilities, but sometimes you just have to make things different. Even if you want to code that into the tank passive, whatever. But I think while this is a good change, it's not going to be enough to make the ability less frustrating as a tank. And I still feel that if you're able to get it to 2 seconds, we can then actually reduce the cooldown. What is it, 12 seconds now? 13 seconds. It just feels really, really frustrating because you want to have an ability that long on a cooldown. Would like to be less potent on a shorter cooldown. But, sure, good change. Primary fire change. Charge game no longer paused by secondary fire nor channeling captive sun. This is a good change. Very, very nice quality of life. One of the more annoying things when playing Illari. Basically means that you were not charging up your next weapon when you were healing, which was very frustrating. So now while you heal, your primary fire charges up, so it allows more comfortable weaving with your abilities. Ammo increase from 14 to 16. I don't like this. I think as it is, a lot of the support cast has massive clips, and I don't think that this is a necessary change. Now fully refills secondary fire resource and resets overheat status when using the ultimate. Sure. Quality of life. Gives it a little bit of nuance. Sure. Removes the damage fall-off penalty on the Sunstruck explosion. Now, I had somebody in my Twitch chat test this. I didn't test this myself, so don't just take my word for it, but don't take my word for it. Go test it. But I'm fairly certain this is the application of the ultimate. So this is worded very confusingly, but it's the application of the. So when you shoot the face the sunrise and it shoots and boom, and it initially goes off, not the actual kill threat explosion where get the damage threshold and it goes boom afterwards, but the initial application, I believe, does 50 damage. And what it means is that anybody hit is going to take 50 damage. And I believe there was some fall off that you could barely be hit by the ult and take like a small portion. I believe that it will always be 50 damage, I believe. You might want to go test that. So these are relatively okay changes. I don't love the ammo change. I don't think it's necessary. But most of these are, if they're buffs, but they are more quality of life buffs, which is, to me, is always more important rather than just flat out buffing numbers for no reason. Good change for Lifeweaver. Obviously, we've talked a lot about Lifeweaver in the past. I have made a lot of videos about his primary fire. The damage is great. It doesn't need to be buffed. The spread is great. In fact, you could argue the spread is almost too powerful. But the projectile speed increase is 100% the buff that he needed. And I'm hoping to see that this maybe opens up a little bit more playmaking opportunity with Lifeweaver. So, good buff. No longer pierced by piercing projectiles. Not a good buff. I know that's a consistency thing, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But it's one of those consistency things that doesn't make for a very good experience for the person playing versus the Lifeweaver. There's already a lot of lacking counterplay around his pedal platform for heroes like Ramantra with his punch and Reinhardt with his fire strike, being the only two things that could consistently, one of the few things that could consistently pierce. And now those things no longer pierce. This is now basically a wall is the way to look at pedal platform now, like Maywall. I don't like that. I don't like that. I think, you making it be consistently, consistent environmental thing, basically where it's a wall, it's a Maywall, it's a block. It just gets in the way. Nothing goes through it. I mean, that makes sense from a consistency standpoint, but Overwatch 2 is already inconsistent. Sombra EMP does cancel some ults, but doesn't cancel others. Some things pierce, some things don't. And there's not always a clear consensus about when and when it doesn't. Overwatch is a confusing game. And if we're moving away from that and trying to make the game more consistent, I think you need to be careful about what changes that you do first, and certainly not in a vacuum, where these are, the counterplay with pedal platform is very limited for many characters. And now you've removed it almost entirely. Is that the first consistency problem that you want to address? Are there not other consistency problems that you might want to address further? And is consistency the altar with which we sacrifice fun? Going back, I believe, what was the other thing that we talked about consistency as well? The fall-off damage penalty with Orisa. I think like that's fine. I think somebody was saying that fall-off damage and projectiles isn't really something that Overwatch 2 does anymore. But are we sure that that's where we're at right now, where Orisa needs that consistency addressed? And if we do address that consistency, should we take a look at the character's kit beyond that? Because this is a big buff, like not a massive buff, but it's a buff, right? So do we want to, if we make it more consistent, do we want to reduce its HP? Do we want to do some other tweak to it? Not because Lifeweaver is overwhelmingly powerful, but do we want to introduce some sort of counterplay to compensate? And the answer is no, we don't. And I think that's probably a mistake. Again, this is not a big deal. This is not where I'm going to go ring the Blizzard developers' doors and run. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but it is something that they've done in the past many times to introduce consistency at the expense of fun. And I don't think that's necessarily a recipe for success, especially when I think you can have your cake and eat it too. So long story short, I talked about this. I give this patch a C- to use an American grading system. Overall, I would say a positive change just because Mauga is nerfed Mauga's not nerfed in the right ways whatsoever, but anything that's going to reduce that character's pick rate and win rate is going to be, a blessing for many of us, even if it is bringing more Orisa in. But it's crazy to me that it was actually this close to being an actively negative patch. Like actively, you did all this work and you actually made the game worse. And the fact that that was even on the table, the fact that it's only a marginally positive change is actually insane. Like really, all they had to do was do more specific Mauga shooting versus tank changes. Leave the armor as is, reduce the health conversion ratio or whatever, make it consume ammo faster. There's been a lot of suggestions about potential tweaks for Mauga, even reducing his crit, reducing the amount of crit damage that he does with his incendiary weapons so that you're less motivated to just fire and farm. There's a lot of changes out there I've seen, and any of them would have done the job just fine. None of them were implemented. We could have gone with a fortify nerf, a small fortify nerf. We could have done that. We could have just not buffed Sojourn at all. And instantly, this patch would have been B or B plus even. Lots of good changes. But just a few changes where they really completely missed the mark, and a few changes that show, somebody in my chat said it the other day, a bit of a misnomer. They said tone deaf, not tone deaf. But yes, a very tone deaf couple of changes that just show that I don't know what they show. I don't know what they show. I really don't know what they show. I don't know if it's a lot of people would say they don't know their own game. I don't know. I don't know if there's an ulterior motive. I don't know if there is a simple solution. I think that what is the phrase that you never assume something is malicious when it could just be incompetence. But at some point in time, we have to know what is your vision, Overwatch 2 developers. What is your goal with heroes? Why do you do changes like these? Why do you do changes like these? I don't think we'll ever really get a full, complete answer. But as long as I'm in this community, I'm always going to be asking that question over and over and over again. I know it's repetitive, but I'm going to keep asking it until I get an answer. Anyway, that's all there is to it, chat.